6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. And it has cleared the tower.
Prepare yourself for a world of science. This is
Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Saturday, 10 o'clock. You know what that means. It is time for the Science Nights. All the Knights are here, and they are assembled, and they're going to be talking about something really, really cool, and that's also really hard. Science is hard. Math is hard. And is math science? I guess it is, right?
Oh, you certainly need a lot of math to do science to do it right. And yeah, thanks for that, Conley. I'm Sean Graham, biologist. We got here Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee, as always, our astronomer physicist, and Dr. Tom Shiller, a paleontologist. And together we cover a really cool piece of ground as far as what kinds of stuff that you could talk about with science. Really interesting topics. Today, we're going to talk about how, and brace yourselves for this, this may be surprising to many of our listeners, maybe not to some. Science sucks. And what I mean by that, it's really hard. Science is really hard.
I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Graham. My science does not suck. I dig up dinosaur bones, so.
Yeah, there's nothing hard about that, right? Nothing tough. And what we're going to do is this is an important thing to talk about, because listeners out there might be under the impression that science is all about, a eureka moment. You can probably picture, somebody like Isaac Newton sitting there getting hit on the head with an apple, and then he figures out several laws of nature, and that's the way it works. You have to be really smart to be a scientist, right? And think a lot, and then you'll get all of that you need. But you know what? To me, in my experience, all science is just a series of obstacles. It's very difficult. This is something that I think a lot of people don't understand, the public doesn't understand, especially our current students don't understand this, and they need to know. And so that's what this show is going to be about. We're going to describe how science sucks. And I'm going to get it started by describing to you a scene. All right, so maybe close your eyes and picture this. Picture it's 1857, 58. And you're in what is now Czechoslovakia. I'm picturing kind of idyllic summertime, little cottages, English ivy growing on some of them, and there's a monastery. And there's monks walking around. This is unusual. There's incredible scientific activity happening. Because in one of those gardens in the monastery are planted hundreds of rows of pea plants. And there is a monk all by himself in his little brown tunic, on his hands and knees, most likely, crouched down, looking at those plants, taking data, examining them. He's clipping the stamens, the little male parts of the plants, off with a pair of tiny little nose hair scissors so that he knows which plant gets what pollen, because he's crossbreeding these plants. And he's dabbing the pollen from one plant to another using a tiny little paintbrush. He's doing all the fertilization, all the pollination himself for hundreds of pea plants. And he's on his hands and knees, and whenever those plants mature, he then counts thousands of seeds and characterizes thousands of seeds that result from those crosses, whether they're yellow, whether they have wrinkled peas or round peas, whether they're tall versus short plants, whether they're white flowers or purple flowers. He's chosen 7 traits to look at across generations. And then he takes all those seeds, he counts them, and then he plants them, and he crosses them again through several generations. And then he starts looking at more than 1 trait at a time, 2 traits at the same time, crossing them, keeping track of all those data in his little notebooks. And this goes on for 8 summers. 8 summers. He's collecting thousands of data on these peas. And from those data, he's able to infer several principles of genetics, of heredity, that are currently still the foundation for our understanding of genes. But it took 8 summers of work in a garden on his hands and knees, and he had plenty of time because he was a monk, and at that time, the Catholic Church was interested in horticulture. They would grow stuff, and they wanted to know how you got certain traits so that they can maybe make a better pea so that they could give those seeds to the people and they could have better gardens. And that's why he was doing it. So the kind of monastery guy, the head guy, the abbot, I guess, was fine with him doing this with his spare time, but he was doing this for years. That is very, very difficult work. And the person I'm describing, of course, is Gregor Mendel, a monk who in the late 1800s figured out inheritance and how it works. All the things you might have ever heard about like dominance and recessive traits and how they're inherited and the kind of ratios that you can get from crossing certain kinds of things, all that very predictive power of how genes work, which I should say nobody understood at the time. All of it figured out by one person in what is now Czechoslovakia. And you'll love what he got for all of his work, the recognition he got. He got no recognition. The abbot saw his work and thought he did a great job. It was published in a German language publication. And Mendel was actually contemporary with Darwin. Darwin knew almost everything there was to know about biology at the time he published Origin of Species. One of the reasons why he was able to put all that together in a unique foundational theory of evolution. But he didn't read German, so he never figured out any of Mendel's work. So Mendel died before his work was ever recognized and never got any recognition for it. He knew he found the answer, but nobody else did. And it wasn't until about the 1920s that scientists went back and found his results, dusted it off, and said, wow, this is the key to inheritance. And they merged it seamlessly with evolutionary theory in what we call now the modern evolutionary synthesis. And Darwin was unaware of his work. Mendel never got recognition, toiled for 8 years, figured out a couple of laws of biology, and there aren't very many laws of biology, several principles, an incredible amount, a lot of hard work, essentially got no recognition for it, certainly no money. And this is how, I'm afraid to say, for all you kids out there who are getting started in science, that's how it works.
I mean, we also want to make sure, like, Mendel was a priest. He wasn't necessarily doing it for the money.
Of course,
So-
and none of us are doing it for the money
money,
either, right?
so
we
we have-
need to be clear about that.
I mean, yes. I mean, we need to survive somehow, but yes. it's
Yeah,
not
It
the
brings
money.
up a good point. And one of the purposes of this show is so we have an excuse to gripe about our students who don't completely understand this yet. They will. But you think back to Mendel and his contemporaries. They weren't going to college. They weren't pursuing a degree. There was no ultimate goal to their work other than discovering something about the natural world. The fundamental purpose of science. We have this curiosity as people. The only organism we know of that is capable of doing science, basically, higher level science, and having this curiosity, this drive to understand the natural world. So I think that fundamental purpose is sometimes overlooked by students. Sometimes.
I mean, it's not students. I mean, it's bad. Like, we shouldn't just say that, but I think it's a general idea of science where you always portray the scientist in a movie wearing this a white lab coat. It's like, and it's always either the scientist is this misunderstood genius or a person who's crazy who's trying to bring hell back on earth or something like that.
Somebody's trying to make giant ants.
Ants, like, without the consequences, try to pursue something without, like, actually understanding what the side effects are going to be. But scientists are not really that, that.
And it's we're trying to among the real people who I want to try to reach with this episode are the people who kind of have an idea of what science is really like, and enjoy science and are hungry for science and the knowledge of science, but may not be aware how hard it is. And maybe if they knew how hard it is going into it, they'll be less likely to just take their first punch, right, and then fall down and then say, I quit. Because that's what this episode has kind of emerged from. I've seen too much of this, especially literally recently. I've seen graduate students who something doesn't go right with their project, and the first sign of trouble, they decide to quit. And I think they are under the impression that science is, all I got to do is formulate a hypothesis, go and test that hypothesis, and then look at my results and get a paper out of it, publish it, and then I get recognition and I get paid. And there are a bunch of things wrong with that. Even formulating a hypothesis takes a lot of background research. You got to look into it. You got to find out if that hypothesis has ever been tested before. You got to do literature search. And most students hate reading, so they don't like doing literature searches. And so they end up, a lot of them will quit at that point. You send them to go find a paper, and they're done.
Coming back to that reading part, and I'll come back to the publishing. Let me first tackle the part about publishing. It's like, yes, publishing is very important in science because you want to communicate science to the rest.
To me, it's the most important thing. I might differ from you guys in that.
Let's have let's talk about but it has to be the curiosity that is the most important part. Before I would say, like having an interest to do the research in the first place.
But the curiosity is great. But I think that if you figure something out and you know it and nobody else knows it, what's the point?
Well,
that's the publishing part. You get that paper out there.
I think it would be more like your duty as a scientist to communicate your results would be fair to say.
Absolutely.
As an important duty, but but that is one part of it. I'm just saying.
For example, had Mendel done 8 years of garden research, got his results, and decided not to publish it, we could be still in the Stone Ages as far as genetics goes. Like, they eventually found his research, even though they didn't find it during his lifetime. Somebody found it, and it's because he published it. If he'd never published it, who knows? Maybe there were people out there before Mendel who got there before Mendel. How would you ever know? That's why I think publishing is super important, and I'm bringing this up not to disagree with you, but to say the publishing part sucks too. It's another component of the terrible hardship that you have to go through, and it's a part that not many people hear about, so we'll talk about it.
Would you guys agree with me in saying that the kind of the misunderstanding with people who are going into science, students or whoever, is the amount of time and effort required to do science? Because that's something I've seen with students in the past. Is, like you said, they think they can come up with their hypothesis, they have the eureka moment, they write it up, and it's over. But it takes hours and hours, days, in some cases, like with Mendel, years to do science. And I think, maybe it's because of all the distractions that people have today, and the digital era with smartphones and video games that, they could knock off at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the evening and play video games or do something on their phone. When I did my thesis and my dissertation, there was not a waking moment that I was not working on it. When I was in the process of writing the thesis and dissertation, there was not a single waking moment that I wasn't doing something towards that, including staying up till 5 o'clock in the morning.
And then it becomes difficult because then you get sick of it. And that usually, almost every project I've ever been involved with, by the end, I never wanted to talk about it again. And I still feel that way about almost every single research
I've heard that from a lot of other scientists.
Like anybody, people will email you thinking you want, hey, that's a really interesting paper. And I'm like, oh, good. Well, I never wanted to speak to anybody about this ever again. It was the worst period of my life.
So bringing it back to that part about reading papers, right, when you said about that.
The literature.
Literature. Like, you cannot formulate a hypothesis without having read sufficient amount of background material. And this is why I would think having a good advisor is great, because you need to be pointed. It's very few people. One needs to understand, is Einstein. Like, Einstein sat in his own the patent office and reading the material, but advisors are where it comes in to point you in the right direction of what you want to do, or rather, like, what are the questions that need to be answered, and pointing in the direction. And then, if your personal responsibility comes into play, I would assume that out of the 7 days in a week, you all have had, if you put the hours in together, at least an entire day was filled with reading papers. Like, would you agree with that? At least
when I was still in training.
Yeah, not just sitting in your, not just doing it, just reading papers. You put the hours together, and so reading a paper takes concentration, and it's not the fun part, because at that part you might be thinking that, well, I need to be observing, but I'm not saying reading papers are not fun, but you think, like, as a student, that you need to be doing something else.
And how, for the listeners who are not familiar with the scientific literature, maybe you could tell them how scientific papers are to read compared to, say, a National Geographic article.
They are dry.
They're the worst.
They are dry, and
they suck.
And it's written. I mean,
they're full of acronyms, and it's the worst. And you got to get used to reading them.
Yes.
And for a beginner,
it's hard. It's very, very hard.
It takes a lot of practice.
Like, that's why every advisor, like, who is a good advisor, will tell you, read the abstract, read the introduction, then go to the conclusion. Because most of the good advisors know in the way they have done the methods and the data sets they generated, those are hard to read. Those takes patience. You get into that later. So
yeah.
But,
and I got in the habit of my way of reading papers now is like abstract, introduction, discussion, and then I go back to the methods if I have any questions about whether or not I think
I do the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because we're jaded. And we've gone through this a lot. We've done it a bunch, so you develop your own way of doing it. But I always recommend for my beginning students to read the whole thing. They don't get that luxury of skipping around because they don't know what's important.
No, absolutely.
What I always tell my students, and this is something that my advisors told me when I was a student, is, especially if you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, you have to be an expert. You have to become an expert in that topic. And I've told all of my graduate students that they need to know more about what they're studying than I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
They need to be experts.
Like, when I started studying, the main thing would be to focus. Yes, the paper was important. When you're initial, as a student, you need to focus on the introduction a lot more, because that's where your literatures are. That's where you will find something. Oh, this is a very interesting concept this paper is referencing to. Maybe I can go and look at that up. Yeah. So it's kind of like a very fun process, but it's also not very. It's not like fun in the say how would I describe it?
It's like detective work. I always thought it was like detective work. You're following leads. You're finding this kind of complex spider web of different papers, and at some point you realize that you've got a big circle. You put a big lasso around all of the literature that's out there, and then you are the expert. You know the boundaries of what is known about the topic, and you can figure out what to contribute. Something new.
And that takes like 3 to 4 years.
That takes a lot of time to figure it out. It's really hard.
Yeah, well, we're going to take a quick break. After the break, but you're getting to something, all of y'all are getting to something really interesting. Just from my particular research that I've been doing, and, I have a lot of friends and, family members in academia, the rabbit holes. It seems like they can go on and on and on forever.
Well, with the internet, they almost do go on forever.
Literally, yeah, for sure. And maybe after the break, we can talk about how to stop yourself and maybe, how to kind of focus on exactly what you're doing. And where do you draw the line between your idea, your basically general idea of what you want to do, and then when you get to a piece of information within the lit review, to that really kind of substantially changes it.
You might find this surprising, but it's really hard. That part is one of the hardest parts.
And it sucks.
And it's all right. Hey, we're going to be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. All right, we are back with the Science Nights, and before the break, I was actually asking our crusading trio right here, A question about, when you're going into researching, and it doesn't even have to be in academia, right? Because if you're just interested in something, and as long as you put all your effort into that one thing, well, you can find a lot of rabbit holes around you. And during your pursuit for this knowledge, it's hard to find out where to stop and where to start your actual original research. And that's a question I pose to you three.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the hardest things about science. Like I mentioned earlier, everyone kind of knows the typical what science is supposed to be like. You make observations, you state a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis. Well, people don't realize what that means. That stating and the testing of the hypothesis is really hard work. Even just the stating it part, and that's what you're getting at. Like if you go down a rabbit hole, being able to focus in on some interesting topic to test, knowing what that is and how to do it, how to test it, that takes a lot of practice. And that's what I think like a master's thesis is all about. That's why I usually discourage students from trying to go directly to a PhD, because by the time you're working on a PhD, you should already know how to test a hypothesis, and you would have got that from a master's. And that's why, and in many sense, masters are harder than a PhD because it's a more of an uphill climb to get to stating that thing.
Yeah, and as we were talking about before, the benefit of reading a bunch of scientific publications is not just to learn about whatever you're studying, but especially at like the master's level, you're learning how to write as a scientist. The best way to learn how to write technical, scientific, is to read scientific papers. And it is dry, and it can be boring and tedious, but coming into a master's degree, I see a lot of students who still write using hyperbole, flowery language like they learned in an English class or a literature class. It's completely different. And you read 100 scientific papers, you may discover a technical writing style that you like, and you learn how to replicate it.
You do it by mimicry.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
And that's one of the hardest things. That's a huge hang up for a lot of students. They will not read, so therefore they're never going to be a good writer.
We want to make sure like mimicry is not plagiarism. Yeah. So please want to make sure about that one.
Yeah. That's another problem.
Yeah, so that's a different can of worms altogether. Another thing, you guys, when we were saying masters and PhD, you mean like do a separate master's degree and then again join the PhD program as a separate PhD program, right? Because like usually that would mean usually what it means in science is you join the same university and get your master's and PhD on the way. Right. So you don't really have the necessary transition. Now, I know I'm getting into something like completely, but it's a part of if you're going to become a scientist, it's kind of part of this.
Yeah, I think
in the United States, like it's, you don't get that necessarily the break when you're in a university. You join a PhD, you're getting your master's, and there is no break, like a distinctive line which says, okay, you're a master's student and you're a PhD student as you're doing that. So,
And in between, there's this incredibly stressful moment where you realize, yes, you're done with your master's degree, and then you have to look for a place to do your PhD.
If you're doing it in two different places, right? Yeah, exactly.
What you should do.
Yeah, that's what you two are recommending, right? Because I came from a place where I joined a PhD program directly and then did my master's on the way, finished the course, was done in the master's, but I never had that idea. But later on, I do realize like doing a master's with a thesis would have made my PhD much better. Like it would have been an extra year, like doing the coursework and stuff later on, but it still would have helped me in the frustrations that I felt doing the PhD level research with a master's level kind of master's not out of the way it's a little, I think, I would say, I think it's a good suggestion to do master's and then do the PhD.
Exactly. Now, what I'd like to hear you guys tell us now, just to hammer home the point that science sucks, is I want some war stories. I want war stories from both of you about projects that you guys were involved in, and maybe some classic examples from your field. It doesn't have to be your research, but I want personal stories, and I want history of your field of some of the really tough things that happen. Thomas, you go ahead and get us started.
Okay, well, I've talked about this before on previous episodes, but I did my master's and my PhD work in Mexico, in northern Mexico, and along the way I did a whole lot of work separately down in Big Bend National Park. Now, those of you who are familiar with this region of Texas, especially close to the river, and maybe you've been over to the other side of the river, is during the summer it is incredibly hot, unbelievably hot. I've never been to Death Valley, but I would suspect that it reaches those extremes.
You're saying it's hot in the desert.
It's hot in the desert, believe it or not.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I'm blowing people's minds right now, but it's hot in the desert, especially during the summertime. Now, another thing that we struggle with as scientists, especially scientists in academia, is the amount of time and when we're available to actually do field work. And it turns out the summertime is really one of the only times during the year, if we're not teaching summer classes, that is, that we can go out and do our field work. So when I did my work down in Mexico, especially for my dissertation, it required a lot of field work, a lot of hiking around, mapping, doing stratigraphy, looking for fossils during the summer. And the last time I went down to Mexico to do some work, I was staying in this ejido, a little village in northern Coahuila. And it was around the late part of the summer. It was in September. And they had a special word that they used for that time of the year that I had never heard before. It's called the canicula. And I asked my wife is from Mexico. She had never heard this term at all before either. So what is the canicula?
Canicula?
Canicula. Everyone in town was saying, es la canicula, as they were making fun of me for being out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon doing field work while they sat in the shade. And I realized through some really difficult language gymnastics with the matriarch of the family I was staying with, that canicula is kind of the translation of the dog days of the summer. You know, CAN, like canine, right? The dog days.
Oh.
So they didn't have any temperature gauges or anything like that in this town, but it was the hottest I had ever experienced it. And I'd worked a lot in Big Bend at that point, even during the summer. It must have been over like 125 degrees. So that being said, in my field, as a field paleontologist and a stratigrapher, requires a lot of work outside in the field. A lot of hiking around. If you do find something to dig up, you're out there in the open desert, digging, doing grunt work, trying to excavate bones that could weigh over 200 pounds.
And that digging is not what most people probably think of when they're thinking of digging up dinosaurs. You're using an awl. You're using practically dental implements, and it takes a long time. And
Yeah,
you're just
once you get down
you're
to the bones.
sitting there in the dirt for all day.
Yeah,
chipping away.
yeah, and you got to experience that with
I did.
And you can't just say it's a 2-day or a 3-day. It's months, I would assume.
It's
It could
whenever
be
it gets done.
Yeah, it's whenever it gets done, I guess, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have to carry the stuff out.
Yeah, and when you said that this town, and I assume you don't really have access where you can. I'm doing the field work, but I can go back to my cool air conditioning room in the night, chill out, relax. I'm assuming that's not happening. Yeah.
No, the town I was staying at in Mexico had no air conditioning. There were 2 refrigerators in the entire town. So no, it was incredibly unpleasant, and there were a lot of mosquitoes too because it was kind of during the rainy season.
How many summers did you spend for your PhD?
3 summers.
How bad did that suck?
It was pretty bad.
Yeah.
And additionally, I'm miles away from my family. I was away from my wife for long periods of time, and I just had a satellite phone that I could use every once in a while to call her and tell her that I was still alive, basically.
That's something I'm glad you touched on, because there's this loneliness involved in this stuff, the field research, and you're just out there by yourself most of the time. I think that gets to a lot of students. I'll bet it weeds a lot of them out.
I think so. And just the physical rigors of doing it. You have to be in shape. It's difficult to tell a student that, no, you're not in the physical condition to go hike around all day in 120 degree heat. And it's a common mistake, especially in my field, with the Jurassic Park generation. There's so many kids who grew up with Jurassic Park and they want to be paleontologists. Now, I'm not trying to sound like a tough guy or anything like that, but what we've been talking about in this episode is kind of the poor understanding that people have about what goes into different facets of science, and especially paleontology. You go to a professional conference in paleontology, and you see a lot of kids who don't know what they're getting into. A lot of them that kind of flush out because they can't do field work. They can't go out and dig up bones. There is a lot of lab work involved, but that's not the only component. Same goes for something like archaeology or biology, even astronomy.
To analyze your bones, you need to get the bones in the first place, and that means digging up the bones.
That's right.
Digging them and cleaning them. And that's the lab part you're talking about, where you're using dental tools, and it takes months.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly tedious process. A lot of institutions, they have preparators who all their time is devoted to that stage of the process. But I'm kind of a one-man show when it comes to my paleo program here at Sul Ross. So I do every stage of the process. Luckily, I have some grad students who I can go out in the field and load up hundreds of pounds of bones and bring it back and say, listen, you might not want to go out in the field, you might not want to do field work, but I have some bones here that you can clean up and cut your teeth in that way.
When you say certain universities have preparators, right? That's the correct word, right?
Yes.
These people who clean up, what you say, when you get the bones back, right?
Yes.
But I understand, but that is only a part of the process. And these universities that you're talking about are pretty big universities.
Yes, correct.
I would assume not every university would have that kind of
No, even at Texas Tech, we did not have a designated preparator, at least in the geology department.
So
the museum had some.
But could you get them from that museum to work on your PhD stuff?
No.
Okay, so that's exactly what. That's exactly what I was getting to. So you had to do it on your own.
I had to do it on my own, which was a good thing. You want to learn every possible.
I don't know. I'm just saying. I just wanted to make that clear. Like when we talk about even Texas State, it is a pretty big university in Texas, and in the world, you didn't have the resources for yourself.
Yeah. So I'd have to say that would be the biggest struggle I had. And one thing also to mention, we talked about the difference between a master's degree and a PhD. Master's degree typically takes less time to complete than a PhD, to write a dissertation. My dissertation was almost twice as long, twice as many pages as my master's thesis. But I would say the dissertation was actually easier. It took me less time to complete than writing my thesis. But that's a whole other story. We can talk about that.
Yeah, that's because the training involved in getting that master's first is really important.
So, what about you, Dr. Graham? What's your war story?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you an interesting war story because I've had similarly brutal field experiences, in the desert and swamps, mosquitoes, tropical diseases, you name it, and that's kind of field biologists almost love that stuff. We love telling those stories, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we do it is because we want to challenge ourselves that way. We're crazy, but I'll give you an example of one where it wasn't particularly physically difficult. But it's a good example of what we're talking about, where the work kind of sucks. So I did surveys for a rare salamander species when I was at Auburn University in Alabama. No one had really done surveys for this beautiful, charismatic salamander, the hellbender. It's the largest salamander in North America. It's this brutal, ugly, fleshy salamander, really cool, charismatic. And most people, who are herpetologists, amphibian and reptile biologists, would love to see these things. They're among the most cool species to work on. So when I realized that no one had really done any surveys for them Alabama to determine what their conservation status was, right? Are they rare? Are they doing very well? I took it upon myself to kind of recruit a bunch of people to pitch in to survey several streams in northern Alabama. And it was incredible to me how few people wanted to be involved. They said they wanted to do it, and then they wouldn't actually participate. So it was like pulling teeth to get anybody to help. And so I ended up doing a lion's share of the work on my own or with friends that I recruited to help me while I was working on my PhD on a totally different topic. And we put hundreds of person hours into surveying these streams. And here's the interesting part. We never found anything. So we put in hours and hours of work and never had any payoff. But in order to establish that something is not there, you can't just say, I looked for 10 hours and I couldn't find it, so they're not there. You got to put in enough time to convince somebody that you put in enough time that they're not there. So you're putting in hours and hours of backbreaking work. This involves flipping humongous rocks on stream beds and snorkeling and swimming, going down rivers in canoes, trying to cover all the rivers where they'd ever been found in the past. And we established pretty firmly they're not there. And this is the only paper I've ever heard of where I published and had 0 data points. Our results were 0, and we published that. And it was a nightmare. And that's why it was so hard to convince people to help. Because they would go out once, strike out, and they wouldn't go out again.
So we have a term in science for that. Null hypothesis. Like you basically, if it's a result is a null result, you still publish it.
You can still publish it. Yeah.
Because it says that you're actually helping another person from not doing the same thing. It's like they know there is something is not there. Do not do this. So that's the thing, and that's also part of science.
And it was from this study, it was like a conservation thing, because it was like, look, we actually argued in the paper that we shouldn't be worried about the conservation of this species in Alabama because it doesn't occur there. It's like worrying about the conservation status of a tyrannosaur in Alabama.
Or like a dodo.
It's the same thing. It's extinct. So any money spent on the conservation of hellbenders in Alabama would be wasted. You need to put it towards something that's still there, that has a chance of recovering, and do not waste money trying to conserve hellbenders in Alabama.
That is exactly what I was trying to say. Like even a null result is important. You need to go and do that.
Yeah, your story reminded me of another really quick story I can tell here. So you talked about how you helped other graduate students. This is another thing that happens, especially at bigger universities, is graduate students will help each other with their projects. I was fortunate enough to help a buddy of mine who was working on his PhD when I was, and do a couple of summers up in southeast Alaska doing geology and paleontology up there. And the full story might be better for another time, but the first summer we went up without any sort of cooperation from the Forestry Service. We had to rent a 16-foot skiff to visit all of these islands basically out in the Pacific Ocean. And it was really, really, really tough work. And on one occasion, we almost ran out of gas and almost got shipwrecked on one of these islands. But we'll save that story for a future show. I don't know how we can tie that in with another topic. But, how about you, Anirban? Do you have a good war story for us?
I was so basically since the break's coming up, so I got a pretty short story to tell. So my PhD was on observation, and I was fortunate enough to have graduate students coming up with me, acting as my secondary, because my observatory was 10 miles away from this small little town up on a mountain, 6 miles up a dirt track, which would get covered with snow, and driving was pretty risky. We would have snowcats, big vehicles for removing snow on the track. So my core PhD observations lasted for 3 years, out of which the first year was a complete waste. And I found that out after 6 months of observing that what I wanted wasn't happening. And does it mean it will not ever happen again? The problem with my objects, yes, they might happen again. So you do that next year. So hoping that it changes the way you want it to change. But even the next year when it did change, there was no surety that it would change. But I did the first year of my 6 months of observing, hoping it would change, going up the mountain, staying up entire nights, till morning, 4 a.m., during November, it would go up all the way to 5 a.m., driving all the way back down in snow and everything, and then you don't have a result. You don't get what you want, but you don't give it up because your project sounded interesting and you want to keep on going. So I'm assuming that's what we mean by horror stories, right? And like,
That's a good one.
yeah, and of course we can always talk about people are always making this huge thing about PhD while doing a PhD, having like colleagues who are necessarily not very nice to you, or your faculties who are not very nice to you. But the thing is, like, that's like, I would say that is a part of any job that you will do. You will have colleagues who are not nice to you, your boss is not nice to you, or like somebody on boss's level who's not nice to you, but that is a part of, I don't think there's any difference.
Well, we'll continue to our belly aching session here after the break. Come back for the Science Nights here in a couple minutes.
All right, so we're back from our break. Thank you for the sponsors. And I don't want to give the listeners the impression that it's always bad all the time. It is kind of a negative episode. We're going to keep that negative thing going because I think it's kind of a public service announcement. But there are ups and downs in science. And a lot of times, if you just focus on the downs, that's when it gets really hard. And I always, you can see when colleagues are going through a bad spate. You could tell. And you got to kind of remind them there are these beautiful ups and downs. The downs often are really, really, really hard and tough. But then the payoff is when there's an up. When I used to call them medal moments. Whenever I was working on my PhD and something went right, and I analyzed my data and I found interesting patterns that would be really cool to report, I would, I'd do air metal. I'd play an air guitar, and I'd be really excited. So sometimes, and that's kind of what keeps us going, are those really good ups.
Yeah, not to be too philosophical or transcendental here, but I always compare my science, and this is probably the same with biology, to fishing. If there are any fishermen or fisher people out there listening, sometimes you go out, you have a great day, you load up your ice chest with fish. Same thing goes for paleontology. Sometimes you go out and you find that T-Rex skull or whatever you're out there looking for. But even if you don't, you're still out in Big Bend. You're not sitting in an office. At the end of the day, you pull out your camp chair, you sit down, you have an ice cold beverage, you watch the sun go down. It's just like fishing. You had a good day. You did some science. You might not have had any results, but you were out there doing it, right?
That's great. So, Anirban, I would love to hear another example. I think astronomy is probably even more misunderstood than any of our fields. So do you have an example from your field of a good story about kind of astronomy, some hardship, when astronomy sucks?
So before we get into this, one thing we have to mention before we say this, it's about perseverance. It's like how you persevere in the face of difficulties. So right now, you don't have to be really, really brilliant. Many brilliant students tend to drop out because you have to face the hardships. You have to be very clear about that. Brilliance will only get you so far. It won't get you over the finish line. So
hard work will get you the rest of the way.
And determination
That's
to do that.
Part of the reason why I wanted to do this episode is for kids out there who are under the misimpression that science is about like the smartest person. No, it's usually the hardest working person. So you can be a moron like me and still be pretty good at science.
I wouldn't say moron, but okay, you need to be that. But
we're all goobers.
Yeah. So okay. So I want to talk about in the show with like this scientist whose name is Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin. So let me give a brief bio. Born in like 1900. 1900. She became the first female professor in Harvard, and she was the first female PhD to graduate from Harvard. So as you can see, she was a trailblazer in her times, and she, at the end of the day, so it seems like her career was like she ended on a very high note. She trailblazed her way through becoming this amazing, an idol for young female scientists to come across. she had her share of difficulties along the way. Now, if you're thinking it is going to be a tale of sexism, this is not a tale of sexism, but the thing about how science works, how the current ideas of science and how when you challenge them kind of thing. So when she first did her PhD thesis, her thesis was came up with this revelation that our sun is actually mostly made out of hydrogen and helium and not made out of what at that point we thought that sun is made out of what Earth was made out of, just at a very high temperature, just evaporated materials on Earth. You just evaporate them and that's what sun was made out of. That was the current thinking at that time. She challenged that using a theoretical equation called the Saha equation. Using that, she said, this is why the observations are matching up. The spectrum matches up the way with the theoretical results, what this equation is predicting. Now, when she presented her result, she was told that her results were spurious by one of her dissertation committee members.
Spurious.
Spurious.
So, hokey pokey.
Hokey pokey.
Loosey-goosey.
Yeah. Now, 5 years later, the same person publishes results, and he had to acknowledge that her initial explanation was the right one 5 years later. So she got vindicated in her lifetime, unlike Mendel, who didn't know what his contribution was. She actually got vindicated. So I would like to point out, yes, there will be obstacles, but at that same time, I want to, did she give up on astronomy? No, she didn't. Was she frustrated? Yes, she was. She still continued working on science. She still was an astronomer. She did over 1 million observations of Magellanic Cloud and all those variable stars. So there's a lot of stuff she did.
Over 1 million observations?
That's minimum, million. I'm just sure, that's at the top of my head, I'm telling you.
Oh, okay.
I think it's way more than 1 million observations she did.
That's a lot of coffee.
That's a lot of coffee you're talking about. So you can see, so she did not stop. She did not stop right there. And interestingly, she could have been a botanist. Did you know that?
Oh, I didn't know that. How
because
about that?
yes, when she was 15, she made a detailed note of the plants that grew in her neighborhood in England, and went to a botanist. And the botanist told her, and say, "Oh, this is not the way you do botany. This is not the way you make like your records." And what it turns out, loss for botany, gain for astronomy.
Hey, that's incredible. And how about that? That's a lot of times people who make the big contributions are not the kind of people you would expect them to be, right? Who would have predicted a Catholic monk would have made a major contribution to field of biology?
Absolutely.
So thinking outside the box, hard work, and not necessarily being the person you'd ever expect. That's another kind of message to the young people out there that you can make a big difference.
So Cecilia Payne, like I will say the words of Cecilia Payne, she has very nice words for this. So
right. So I was just talking about ups and downs, and she went through some serious downs.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
so if you're going through some downs, remember these words.
the reward of the young scientist is the emotional thrill of being the first person in the history of the world to see something or understand something. Nothing can compare with that experience. The reward of the old scientist is the sense of having seen a vague sketch grow into a masterly landscape.
Wow.
Very
How
cool.
about that? That's exactly right.
Yep.
And that's, seeing something for the first time. That's the payoff, everybody. It's not money. It's not a degree. It is seeing something that no other person has ever seen or understood.
It's
And
the
then
big
telling
fish.
people about it.
And-
you get to write, and you're the first person to tell
And
someone.
it could be
about
insignificant. You have to mention, but it is it
It's
doesn't
still,
matter.
Yeah,
It's
it
still
doesn't
you're
matter.
the
The
first person.
scale, it doesn't have to be covered by
Yes.
National Geographic.
Or nature.
That's
or
what part that I think is personal.
Yes.
It can be something beautiful to you that's the first time you've experienced it. And it doesn't have to be the big heavy hitting discovery, but it's still yours.
So we're ending the episode on a high note. Very good. Not all negative here. We don't want to dissuade anyone from the sciences. It is hard work, but it's a lot of fun. Now, next week, we'll be talking about superfluids. Don't know what a superfluid is? I don't really either, but Dr. Bhattacharjee knows what a superfluid is. And he's gonna teach us about superfluids, and we're gonna have a nice conversation about
That's stretching it. Teaching.
teaching.
We'll see you guys next week on the Science Nights.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Science Nights in the Morning. Be sure and follow us on Patreon for exclusive gear and uncut episodes. Check out the latest science articles on our Facebook page and subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast listening app. You can also listen every Saturday at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time at BigBenRadio.com. And if you got a question, we'll join the discussion. Hit the hotline at 432-217-1983 and record your message. We couldn't do this without you, and thank you so much for listening each and every week. That's Science Nights in the Morning with a K, and we'll see you next time.